Bom dia,
Good
boa noite,
morning,
boa
good
tarde
night,
para
good
você.
afternoon to
Sabemos o
you. We don't know
Festival
your time
Digital
zone. We are in a
Internacional,
digital
Festival
international
Internacional
festival,
Latitude, então a gente
Festival
não sabe
Latitude.
exatamente
So we don't
o
know
horário de cada
exactly the time
mas
of
enfim,
all of
seja
you. But
bem-vindo. Meu nome é
anyway,
Aldri Anunciação. Queria
welcome. My
agradecer
name
ao
is Aldri
Festival
Anunciação. I would like
Internacional
to thank
Latitude por
the
estar
Latitude
conduzindo
Festival
essa
for conducting
conversa
this
aqui. E aí já
conversation here
apresento quem são as
and
pessoas
already
distribuídas.
presenting the people
São
that are here
Laís
with us,
Machado e
Laís
Diego
Machado
Araúja.
and
Diego
Diego
Araúja,
Araúja.
ambos
Both of
pertencentes
them
à
belonging
plataforma
to the
Maracá,
Maracá
que também
platform,
está com uma
which is
obra,
also
uma
working
experimentação
on
em
a
vídeo
video
nesse festival.
experimentation
Basta
in this
acompanhar aí na
festival. You just have
programação
to
e o
follow the
convite também
program.
da plataforma
And the
Maracá que está
curriculum of the Araka platform
no
is
site
also
desse
on the
festival.
website of the
Ambos
festival.
trazem aqui uma
Both of
questão,
them
a gente vai partir
bringing a
direto
question
desse
here.
assunto,
We'll go straight to that issue,
com uma discussão
which is a
sobre
discussion
poéticas
about the
afrodiaspóricas,
Afro-diasporic
tendo como
poetics,
norte
focused
as
mainly on
barreiras
the structural
estruturais
barriers
postas
imposed
pelo
by the
plano
global
global,
system,
tendo também
and
como
having
ferramentas o
as a
conceito
tool for
dessa
this
discussão que a gente vai
discussion
fazer
that
agora,
we're going to do
os
now,
conceitos de
the concepts of
afro-perspectiva e
Afro-perspective and
afro-referência.
Afro-reference.
Olá, Diego.
Hello,
Olá,
Diego. Hello,
Laís.
Laís.
Obrigado.
Thank you
Queria
for
convidá-los
inviting
também
me
para o
along
festival
with
para
the
estar aqui com
festival
vocês,
to
né?
be here with you. Well, we're the one who thanks the participation on the Latitude Festival. We thank you for accepting the invitation, and that's it. Good morning, good afternoon, good night to all
Então,
of
bom dia, boa
you.
tarde, boa noite. Vamos direto ao
So
assunto,
let's
então.
go straight to the issue.
Já trazendo
Already
uma
approaching
articulação
the
com uma discussão que vai
discussion
ser
that you're
gerada,
going to
que é
bring, which is
justamente as poéticas
precisely the
afrodiaspóricas,
Afro-diasporic
tendo como
poetics,
norte essas
having
barreiras
around it
postas
these barriers imposed
pelo plano
by the
global.
global
Eu queria
scope.
trazer,
I would
para
like to
além desses
bring, in
conceitos que vocês
addition to these
trazem, de
concepts that you're bringing of
afro-perspectiva e de
Afro-perspective and Afro-reference,
afro-referência, o
I'd
conceito
like
que
to
traz
remember
aqui do
the
conceito de
concept of
afrocentricidade,
Afrocentricity
do Mofete
by
Santi,
Mofete
que é um
Santi,
afro-americano,
the
que tenta dar mais
Afro-American
um resumo
artist,
bastante rápido
which
e ligeiro,
which
propondo que
actually
o
proposes that
afro-diaspórico
the
é uma disciplina
Afro-diaspora and the
sujeito e
African are
objeto
subjects
dos
and
seus
objects
estudos,
of their own
experimentações e
studies,
linguagens
their
artísticas. Ele amplia
experimentations,
isso, né? Não fica somente no
and
âmbito
he
das
amplifies it. He's
linguagens,
not only
mas
on the language
também
word, but
da
also
sociologia, enfim.
he
Então,
treats
assim, o
he treats
africano
about
afrodiaspórico
sociology.
como
So it
sujeito e
is the
objeto,
African in the
tendo
Afro-diasporic as the subject
como
of
fonte
his
por
work.
base
And having a
esse
Sanchi as a
desenvolvimento
foundation,
que esses
how would you
conceitos estão
describe these
trazendo para essa
concepts that you
discussão,
are bringing
que
to
é
this discussion? Meaning
afro-perspectividade
the
e
Afro-perspective and
afro-referência.
the
O que é
Afro-reference.
isso para
What
vocês?
is this to you? Well, the Afro-reference, it's in a zone of analysis and of production of relationships between people and their works of Black artists. So this interaction, it really leads to the production of a species of references, of assemblages. They could be symbolic or ethic or aesthetic. That this artist, that the Black artist is agenting inside its own work or inside its production, being it intellectual or artistic or philosophical. So the Afro-reference, in the way that we are approaching it, Laís and I, in the Maracá platform, it has an intimate relationship to the analytical way, meaning the way that you actually relate, how you actually approach this work. Being you a person without this baggage of these references or not, you know? And if you do not have this baggage, then it demands another kind of work of interaction that also goes through the experiences, your personal experiences of this Black author.
A gente pode pensar que a
So
afro-referência
can we think that the
diretamente
Afro-reference will be
relacionada
directly
aos
connected
modos
to the ways,
poéticos,
to the
independente
poetics,
desses
independently
sujeitos
of this
serem
subject being
africano,
African
afrodiaspórico
or
ou não?
Afro-diasporic or
Ou seja,
not?
são referências,
Meaning
são
these are
dados
references and
de
data
produção,
of
construção de
works,
cena que
constructions of
tem como
scenes
sua
that
base
has as its foundation
origens ancestrais africanas, independente de quem está
African
manipulando isso ou
ancestors,
não, seja um
independently
branco,
of
um
who is
negro, um
manipulating it, being
esses
a
seriam
white
as
person or a black
afro-referências?
person. Would it be the Afro-reference? Yes and
Por
no.
que não? Por que
Yes
que
and
por que
no.
não?
So why yes or not? Yes, because there is an expectation about what is Afro. So there already is a few approaches that are already acknowledged as approaches of an Afro universe, of African universe, that not always corresponds to the reality. But at the same time, not because we could always talk about all the experiences and baggages of life that actually interfere and in a certain way they define and arrange and draw their approaches about any kind of context. So in that case, we fall into another concept that I think Diego can talk a little bit better about it. That is the idea of the Afro-Perspective. Okay, so we just defined what is the Afro-Reference, that has this, it's about the relationships that is originated in the ancestrality in its poetics. So what would be then the Afro-Perspective, and what is the difference between the Afro-Perspective and the Afro-Reference? Let's work now on the Afro-Perspective. The Afro-Perspective, the first time I heard about it was with Gianni Lima, which is a Brazilian curator from Bahia. She's an art curator from Brazil. And she also has an arrangement, a philosophical arrangement. So a professor called Renato Nogueira, a black professor from a university in Brazil, he pointed a tendency on the philosophical area of what he called the Afro-Perspective, having as influence Diego Nascimento, which is an important Brazilian black artist, also Pan-Africanist. And this in the art, it reflects on two things, which are to create experiments, new epistemes, which is in a field of experimentation which is very wide, which in the artistic ways, at least in Brazil, it was something that was hidden and denied for the black production, which is usually seen as a thematic point of view. So the Afro-Perspective is actually this black author that is producing, having a starting point, his own ethical visions, political visions, and aesthetic. And as a consequence, from this point of view, he'll be able to be in a land of experimentation, you know, especially because it's in a dialogue with tendency and aspects, personal aspects also, because these are personal motivations that are obviously going to have a fundamental to the art. So that lands on the experimentation fields in the production of methodologies, creative methodologies. So this is a little bit how we can approach the Afro-Perspective in the field of the method, of the concept, and of the personal motivation of this black artist. So for what you're bringing, the Afro-Perspective would be the look, an Afro-diasporic or African look upon a subject, whatever object it could be, being an object of African or Western elements. If there is an African look upon the subject of any kind of language, if there is an African look upon this object, then we have the Afro-Perspective. Is that it? Yes, especially because when we talk about the analysis, the production, the creation, from a perspective that is been denied by another global project that we will talk about soon. But is the entry of this perspective in the analysis of any object, the entry of this perspective by this individual or by this social group or these thinkers, creators, that for a long time have been fighting for legitimacy. So one thing that is important to say is that I feel that the idea of Afro-Reference and the concept of Afro-Perspective, they're actually connected in some points. And then something that is also important for a conversation is that the absolute split of this these ideas, it characterizes to me the idea of extractivism. Because when you're able to split these two things that are connected naturally, an extractive ethics is born. It's interesting for you to say that because define these two concepts that we can understand the Afro-Perspective, that is the look of the Afro-diaspora upon an object, and the Afro-Reference as the ways, the relationships, the means of creation of the scenes. When we work about the language, where it's also understood that the work can be also be Afro-Reference without having the Afro-diaspora behind it. Having these two concepts, tell me, entering the issue that you are bringing, in which way the non-comprehension of these two concepts of Afro-perspective and Afro-reference, how not understanding it, how can it favor the creation of structural barriers in a global scope for the Afro-diasporic artist? How not understanding these elements actually be a prejudice, the resources for these artists to produce these works. I refer to the Afro and African artists. How not knowing these tools can actually do this? Well, I think it starts by the fact that when we talk about the distribution of resources, it's not equal or not even close to a equivalence. The idea of an Afro-reference work not being produced by a Black, African, or Afro artist. The distribution of the resources is not equivalent to the distribution of resources to that of an Afro-African artist, thinking in dialogue with the Afro-perspective in relation to a theme or an approach or a method that is not immediately understood at first as Afro-reference. So there is a difference in this resource because there are initiatives that try to actually repair the depths, but that only tolerate you within that space by giving certain references that are understood by them as Afro-reference. Because then again, what is Afro-reference? From what perspective are we defining this as Afro-reference? Thinking about whose hands that holds the resources that are distributed to the art, what place does that person define to me, you know? Because for ages and centuries, our history is made up of this. People that attract the resources from Afro-referring works and issues that were not necessarily African of Afro-diaspora, but managed to extract this resource. But at the same time, you have a refusal, a resistance to the distribution of these resources, both through Afro-diasporic African artists that tried to retake this, which became an object in the hand of the white people to develop the object itself as a subject, as well for all the Black artists who choose to experiment within areas that are not recognized as Afro-reference. So you just said that thinking about the Afro-reference in a separate way from the Afro-perspective and not thinking about them together, to think about it together, it favors the extractivism. Which is the extractivism that you're talking about? Well, of the resources, about the distribution of resources. So when we think about Brazil, for example, that is our territory where we are, how it was all of the historical process of inclusion of the Black population in all of the areas of knowledge of Brazil after the abolition of slavery. There was no insertion policy, but at the same time, fortunes had been made with those bodies, with those lives, with that sweat, with that blood and everything, but that money never returns. Then speaking about art, I will bring an example that we were talking about before this conversation, that is the Nefertiti case. So you have a museum that maintains Nefertiti because objects don't have the economic structure to handle it. And even with the claim to have it back. So why can't this resource be returned then? Why can't it be returned so they can take care of a work of art that is a World Heritage Site? So how are these resources distributed, And which kinds of invitations are made to the Black artists? Which places can these artists occupy with their work? As for artworks or concept or intellectual productions, what are they willing to hear from us? I think everything that is outside this perspective do not have space, as a consequence do not have resources to produce. But with no resources, it's just exhausting. Well, having the Brazilian space as a case study, we see a few events, a few artistic works here in Brazil that are Afro-Reference, but they're not, they don't have Afro-Perspective. Do you think that happens exactly due to this confusion of concepts of these Afro-Reference work that do not have in its constitution, in the structure, a Afro-Perspective? Do you think this happens due to this confusion of concepts? Do you think that if we clarify what is Afro-Reference and what is Afro-Perspective, can we actually favor a decrease of these barriers, of these structural barriers, or not? I think we can, beyond actually minimizing these barriers until they do not exist anymore, what we can do is to provide the rights to these artists of the Afro diaspora, and also in the Brazilian context, for these artists to have the rights to the production of knowledge in art, to the production of intellectual and theoretical knowledge. And why do I say that? Because if we start at first from a relationship with the work of these people, from us, Black artists, if we start from what is understood in the superficial fields of what will be a Black art, of what will be a Black philosophy, and what will be a Black production, we are then preventing, or at least not supporting, a production that is not in the laboratory field to create new epistemes. And when I talk about creating new epistemes, I don't talk about the visibility to Black epistemes, because in a certain way, this happens, even due to the extractivist context. Meaning, when I talk about the Black epistemes, I talk about the Brazilian work, which could be the candomblé, the capoeira, the cavalo marinho. And these epistemes, they have a field between some diasporas of knowledge. So when I create new epistemes, I speak of an experimental field of Black thinkers from all fields of knowledge production. So it's interesting that you say that, because the Black epistemes, they can be used, in fact, by people that are not actually Black. And then enters the issue of the extractivism that Laís brought to us. So when I think that the Afro-Perspective, does he only work with the Afro-Reference, or can we have the Afro-Perspective with works that are Eurocentered? How do you see this relationship of the Afro-Perspective working with objects that are not objects related to the ancestrality? Because a few artists have this relationship, and sometimes this favors or not barriers of resources. How do you see this relationship between the Afro-Perspective with other references that are not Afro? I feel that for as long as we don't Afro-Perspective everything, we cannot update what the Afro-Reference would be. And then when I think about this dialogue with the idea of the extractivism, how does it keep up working parallel with the isolation project? So you have some difficulty to actually bring out Black experimentation work. You go through the language barrier, which, again, taking Brazil as a case study, is not common for Black people to learn a second language. And that is an aspect that is the privilege of wealthy classes in Brazil. And then you have the difficulty to get resources to travel with your works, to distribute them in other places. And And then it isolates us from all the experiments that are being done by other Black artists in all of over the world, both in the African continent, also in the diaspora. And then when I think about solutions and things that could be done to remove this, things that could be done to actually repair this, it involves the occupation of people who can give an Afro-perspective to the people that are distributing these resources and legitimizes the concepts and the productions. Because if not, we are always stuck in the idea of the Afro-Reference that is stuck in time, and this idea is not updated. What is Afro-Reference in 2020? What would be considered as Afro-Reference in 2020 if our experiences also are updated as time goes by? So, also when we think about the Afro-diaspora, because it's also in a crossing, it's not only in Africa, it's also in the Western world, where it acquires other epistemes that connect itself. So from each moment does it start to be Afro-reference. So as we are towards the end of our conversation, what would be the possible reflection? And of course, you're not going to bring a solution for this barrier of the resources imposed to the Black artist inside of the global plan, but what would be a reflection that would walk us towards a possible reflection of a dissolution of these structural barriers imposed to the Afro-diasporic artists and African artists? You have pointed a few, like the education, the languages, but going beyond that, what other reflection would you bring for us to think about the dissolution of these barriers? Do you want to talk about it? Yes, you should. You should talk about it. I wouldn't be able to say it. I wouldn't be able to give a solution, an assertive solution about it. But taking into consideration the productions of Black artists that are around me, my friends, my partners, of Laís, mine, yours, and from many others that are investigating all the possibilities of creation, I think what we should do is a reflection and objectify a critical production of these works, of these productions, indeed, you know? Because what I feel is that in the critical field, in the analytical field, I am not an artist that has circulated a lot. I started to travel with Laís in 2018, for you to have an idea. And next year, we're going to make 10 years in the artistic world. But what I also feel is that in the travels that I have already made, is that there is a specific way to relate to these productions that are actually conditioned to a model, to a more traditional ancient model. Could be from the point of view of the white people that has dealt with the Black people, with works of Black people, or what has been conditioned to what is a Black artist. But I think just by understanding what is the Afro-perspective, that is the Black look into the object, and also the Afro-perspective, that is the relationships, I think it already helps a lot. You are still here on the festival, so can you talk really quickly, because we're finishing this conversation, can you tell us what you're presenting in the festival? So at the festival, we are presenting the second work of the trilogy I'm developing, called Machinery of the End of the World, and this is called the Song of the Daughters of the World, which is an experimentation in video of performances and visuality and photography and also other medias, and all of this about the research that I have been doing about all the possibilities of the feminine, of the female that are not Eurocentric. So just keep up with the festival. I'd really like to thank Laís. I'd like to thank Diego and thank the Latitude Festival for this conversation. And let Afro-Perspective our works and understand what is Afro-Reference as the Black episteme. Thank you very much for both of you. Wish you a good presentation on the festival. See you later. Bye.